Welcome to another installment of European History KOAP Style. In this episode, we're going to delve into the topic of the Eastern European states and the process of westernization that they were becoming more and more involved in. Now, what does westernizing mean? Westernizing is kind of another fancy way of saying that the Eastern European states needed to westernize so that they were backwards. And they were. Out east, they were backwards socially, politically, and economically. They tended not to experience the same commercialization and agricultural revolution that we've discussed that occurred in the Western European nations. Going into these countries in the east, in many ways, were like going back into the Dark Ages. Some of the leaders of these Eastern European nations realized their deficiencies and set out to change this. They wanted to be more like their Western European neighbors. After the success of and power of France, even though it will become eventually bankrupt, other rulers and monarchs began to see the French as the model for becoming relevant and powerful. Some areas that implemented a French style backfired. For example, the Stuarts in England failed miserably, as we talked about in the English Civil War. However, in some nations, you could argue that it made a relative difference and that significant changes took place. And we're going to talk about those in particular in this episode in that of Central Europe and in Russia. While noting how these monarchs mimicked the French model, also make sure you note the beginnings of opposition to absolutism and the privileged rule of kings and the nobility. We need to keep in mind, I know you haven't learned about it since 9th grade really, but we're in the midst of a new development that kind of was spawned in the humanistic, skeptical era of the Renaissance and continued through the scientific revolution. And, of course, I'm talking about the movement that we know of as the Enlightenment and the core ideas of the Enlightenment, such as protection of natural rights, constitutional limitations of rulers, and also things like religious tolerance and freedom of religion. The ideals of the Enlightenment did influence some monarchs. They became known as enlightened absolutists, or some books refer to them as enlightened despots, who adopted some of the ideals, as I said, of the Enlightenment and focused more on being servants of the state, such as Russia and Prussia, rather than the state and its people serving them. Examples will come in the notes. Be sure, students, to understand that these two themes of centralization and enlightened despots or enlightened absolutists, you need to know them. You need to know examples of monarchs and what they did to centralize and westernize their European nations. One thing we need to do is note some of the changes that were going on in Eastern Europe that allowed this process to happen. And one thing to remember, a little acronym, HOPRAP. What does HOPRAP stand for? Well, there are three aging empires. Empires that are kind of on their way out and being relevant and significant. One being the Holy Roman Empire, as we talked about, disintegrated pretty much at the end of the 30 Years' War. The Ottoman Empire, who at this point is known as the old sick man of Europe, and we've also talked about the demise of the Polish kingdom. And what they're going to do is give way to the new empires, the growing powers of RAP, or Russia, Austria, and Prussia. Now, in terms of westernization, we need to understand this. This is also on Key Concept 2.1, Roman numeral 1b. But as we've already talked about, the Spanish, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the English were really starting to thrive in Western Europe after the 30 Years' War as the 1700s was beginning. And many of the European nations further east, again, began to take notice. In Central and Eastern Europe, Prussia, Austria, and Russia would all attempt to become more Western. We're going to give examples here soon with varying amounts of success. And again, westernizing means trying to emulate Western nations' customs, legal practices, and political practices. The leaders of these countries, and you'll have examples here shortly, would all try different methods of reforms to bring the nobles and the finances of their country under their control. At the time, to become more Western, it really meant four things: make the governments more centralized, adopt Western economic policies, again, commercialization instead of serfdom, agrarian peasantry, and improve their military structure and technology. And again, if possible, adopt Western culture and ideas. Now, we will talk about these specifically. Probably one of the best ways to start this is to talk about a guy named Peter the Great. When Peter became the sole ruler of Russia in 1696, the Russian Empire had really only one port. It was in the North Sea. And at the time, the North Baltic was controlled by Sweden, and the Black and Caspian Seas were really commanded respectively by the Ottoman Empire. After capturing the fortresses of Azov from the Ottomans in 1696, Peter was determined to gain further access to the Black Sea. But he knew that at that moment, Russia really couldn't take on the Ottoman Empire alone. So he came up with the idea of something called his Grand Embassy, or his Grand Tour. It was really a diplomatic mission with the goal of securing Allied support against the Ottoman Empire. In particular, this trip sought to strengthen the Holy League, which was a union of Christian empires that Pope Innocent XI had formed in 1684 to kind of put a check on the aggression of the Ottomans in Europe. Russia joined in 1686. You also remember that Austria thwarted a siege of Vienna in 1683, in which the Turks were trying to take over Austria. So it's important to note that there was, not only a political war, but kind of a religious war going on between the European Christian nations and obviously the Muslim Ottoman Empire. Peter also sought to use the journey going west to acquire new knowledge and technology and actually hire foreign specialists to bring back for service in Russia. In 1697, Peter set off with a 250-person entourage on an 18-month journey. Officially, this quote-unquote embassy was headed by 3 of his closest advisors, and Peter used a pseudonym throughout the trip as he wished to maintain anonymity. He wanted to become or remain anonymous. Although Peter was the first czar to travel abroad, he was easily recognizable to a lot of the Western European people. Why? Because A, he was 7 feet tall, just about 7 feet tall. And again, records from that time attest that few European leaders were actually fooled by his incognito disguise. And it's just kind of interesting to think that he didn't want special treatment, and he wished to learn about the new technology in more of a hands-on manner, so he truly understood it. And from there, Peter moved to the Netherlands, where he took on an apprenticeship as a shipbuilder in Zaandam. For the Tsar, learning about naval technology was crucial to his objective of creating a truly modern navy, and the Dutch sailing vessels were considered among the most advanced in the world at that particular time. So Peter was very impressionable during his embassy and came back convinced that certain European customs were superior to Russian ones. Peter announced upon his return that the nobility, members of the nobility, had to mandatorily cut their beards. They had to shave or pay tax, and also wear more European clothing. The calendar was also changed to better align with the European one. And the rest of Peter's reign until his death in 1725 was marked by several victories over Sweden, which led to Russia's status as the supreme power in northeastern Europe. Just going through the artwork, as you can see here, this is Peter doing some dirty work with his shipbuilding, more than likely in the Netherlands. And this is a cartoon that I've seen on the AP exam many times, but this is signifying a member of Peter's staff going ahead and attempting to cut the beard off of the nobles. And as we just said, it is important to note that, as a young ruler, Peter made that trip west to study technology and culture. Really what was his major concern? It was the military and naval might. He wanted to secure that. He believed that was mandatory in order for Russia to become a great power. He also followed a Western model of reform. We talked about making nobilities pay taxes for, if they wanted to keep their beards, and he mandated that they start dressing in more of a Western style. He does, however, he's not an enlightened despot. He rejects the Enlightenment ideals in favor of more absolute control. So when we talk about Peter the Great, we kind of put him up there with absolute monarchy. Much like Louis XIV, Peter had a lot of the nobility move around him, in his case by force. He forced them to be a part of his government. And as we'll talk about, he eventually creates a new government in St. Petersburg. Again, building, like the Dutch, a city on swamplands. And again, he was really, really taking note on that great embassy tour that he made. And in doing so, he took away their independence and took away a lot of the nobility's individual power. In fact, I need you to note this, he created something called the Table of Ranks, which was meant to draw the nobility into state service by equating social position and social standing and privileges with the rank in the bureaucracy or military. So in other words, in doing so, Peter made the standing of the nobility, which is also known as the boyars, dependent on their willingness to serve loyally in the central state. The publication of the Table of Ranks was an effective tool that strengthened the power of Russia by bringing the nobility under the control of the monarchy and having those nobles kind of compete against each other for where their ranking was in terms of favorable standing with Peter. So again, note the Table of Ranks. Peter also took control of the Russian church, and he made all decisions, much like Henry VIII did with the Act of Supremacy. And you could also say that Louis XIV did that with the Edict of Fontainebleau. So again, some similarities there. As I said, he forced the nobility to westernize with shaving or paying tax. It's like the 18th time I've said this in this sigcast, so I apologize. But he reformed his military under the model of the Prussians, and he used nobles as officers and vastly expanded Russian territory to the east and against Poland. And again, they were awarded a higher ranking on the Table of Ranks for their loyalty and serving as nobles or as officers in the Russian military. Kind of also mimicked Louis XIV by building an entire city, much like the Palace of Versailles. And the city was called fittingly enough, Petersburg, and a lavish winter palace for himself. And lastly, as we said, he used his conquest to open up ports in an attempt to open up trade and commercialization like the West. And he did so in a war called the Great Northern War with Sweden and Charles XII. And he did eventually gain access to a warm water port, and Russia became an official Baltic powerhouse.